Our book tonight is The Funhouse by Dean Kootz. Trigger warning. This book does contain death and death of children, which may be triggering to some folks. Please note, this author is very graphic. Prologue. Ellen Straker sat at the small kitchen table in the Airstream travel trailer, listening to the night, trying not to hear the strange scratching that came from the baby's bassinet. Tall oaks, maples, and birches swayed in the dark grove where the trailer was parked. Leaves rustled like starched black skirts of witches. The wind swept down from the cloud-plated Pennsylvania sky, pushing the August darkness through the trees, gently rocking the trailer, groaning, murmuring, sighing, heavy with the scent of oncoming rain. It picked up the hurly-burly sounds of the nearby carnival, tore them apart as if they were fragments of a flimsy fabric, and drove the tattered threads of noise through the screen that covered the open window above the kitchen table. In spite of the wind's incessant voice, Ellen could still hear the faint, unnerving noises that issued from the bassinet at the far end of the 20-foot trailer. Scraping, scratching, dry, rasping, brittle crackling, a papery whisper. The harder she strained to block out those sounds, the more clearly she could hear them. She felt slightly dizzy. That was probably the booze doing its job. She was not much of a drinker, but in the past hour she had tossed down 4 shots of bourbon. Maybe it was 6. She couldn't quite remember whether she had made 3 or only 2 trips to the bottle. She looked at her trembling hands and wondered if she was drunk enough to do something about the baby. Distant lightning flashed beyond the window. Thunder rumbled from the edge of the dark horizon. Ellen turned her eyes slowly to the bassinet, which stood in the shadow at the foot of the bed, and gradually her fear was supplanted by anger. She was angry with Conrad, her husband, and she was angry with herself for having gotten into this. But most of all, she was angry with the baby, because the baby was the hideous, undeniable evidence of her sin. She wanted to kill it and bury it and forget that it had ever existed. But she knew she would have to be drunk in order to choke the life out of the child. She thought she was just about ready. Gingerly, she got up and went to the kitchen sink. She poured the half-melted ice cubes out of her glass, turned the water on, and rinsed the tumbler. Although the cascading water roared when it struck the metal sink, Ellen could still hear the baby, hissing, dragging its small fingers down the inner surfaces of the bassinet. Trying to get out? No, surely that was her imagination. She couldn't possibly hear those thin sounds over the drumming water. She turned off the tap. For a moment, the world seemed to be filled with absolutely perfect, tomb-like silence. Then she heard the sloshing wind once more. It carried with it the distorted music of the calliope that was piping energetically out on the midway. And from within the bassinet, scratching, scrabbling. Suddenly, the child cried out. It was a harsh, grating screech, a single fierce bleat of frustration and anger, then quiet. For a few seconds, the baby was still, utterly motionless, but then it began its relentless movement again. With shaking hands, Ellen put fresh ice in her glass and poured more bourbon. She hadn't intended to drink any more, but the child's scream had been like an intense blast of heat that had burned away the alcohol haze through which she had been moving. She was sober again, and fear flowed swiftly in the wake of the sobriety. Although the night was hot and humid, she shivered. She was no longer capable of murdering the child. She was no longer even brave enough to approach the bassinet. But I've got to do it. She returned to the booth that encircled the kitchen table, sat down, and sipped her whiskey. Trying to regain the courage that came with intoxication, the only sort of courage she seemed able to summon. I'm too young to carry this burden, she thought, and I don't have the strength to handle it. I admit that. God help me. I just don't have the strength. At 20, Ellen Straker was not only much too young to be trapped in the bleak future that now seemed to lie ahead of her. She was also too pretty and vibrant to be condemned to a life of unremitting heartache and crushing responsibility. She was a slender, shapely girl, a butterfly that had never really had a chance to try out its wings. Her hair was dark brown, almost black. So were her large eyes, and there was a natural rosy tint to her cheeks that perfectly complemented her olive skin tone. Before marrying Conrad Straker, she had been Ellen Teresa Marie Giovanetto, the daughter of a handsome Italian-American father and a Madonna-faced Italian-American mother. Ellen's Mediterranean beauty was not the only quality about her that revealed her heritage. She had a talent for finding joy in small things, an expansive personality, a quick smile, and a warmth that were all quite Italian in nature. She was a woman meant for good times, for parties, dances, gaiety. But in her first 20 years of life, there had not been very much laughter. Her childhood was grim. Her adolescence was an ordeal. Although Joseph Giovanetto, her father, had been a warm, good-hearted man, he had also been meek. He had not been the master of his own home, and he hadn't had a great deal to say about how his daughter ought to be raised. Ellen had not been soothed by her father's gentle humor and quiet love nearly so often as she had been subject to her mother's fiery religious zealotry. Gina was the power in the Giovanetto house, and it was to her that Ellen had to answer for the slightest impropriety, real or imagined. There were rules, an endless list of them, which were meant to govern Ellen's behavior, and Gina was determined that every rule would be rigidly enforced and strictly obeyed. She intended to see that her daughter grew up to be a very moral, prim, God-fearing woman. Gina always had been religious, but after the death of her only son, she became fanatically devout. Anthony, Ellen's brother, died of cancer when he was only 7 years old. Ellen was just 4 at the time, too young to understand what was happening to her brother, but old enough to be aware of his frighteningly swift deterioration. To Gina, that tragedy had been a divine judgment leveled against her. She felt that she had somehow failed to please God, and that he had taken her little boy to punish her. She began going to Mass every morning instead of just on Sundays, and she dragged her little girl with her. She lit a candle for Anthony's soul every day of the week without fail. At home, she'd read the Bible from cover to cover, over and over again. Often she forced Ellen to sit and listen to scripture for hours at a time, and even before the girl was old enough to understand what she was hearing. Gina was full of horrible stories about hell, what it was like, what grisly tortures awaited a sinner down there, how easy it was for a wicked child to end up in that sulfurous place. A night young Ellen's sleep was disturbed by hideous, bloody nightmares based on her mother's gruesome tales of fire and damnation. And as Gina became increasingly religious, she added more rules to the list by which Ellen was expected to live. The tiniest infraction was, according to Gina, one more step taken on the road to hell. Joseph, having yielded all authority to his wife early in their marriage, was not able to exert much control over her even in the ordinary times. And when she retreated into her strange world of religious fanaticism, she was so far beyond his reach that he no longer even attempted to influence her decisions. Bewildered by the changes in Gina, unable to cope with the new woman she had become, Joseph spent less and less time at home. He owned a tailor shop, not an extremely prosperous business, but a reliably steady one, and he began to work unusually long hours, When he wasn't working, he passed more time with his friends than he did with his family. And as a result, Ellen was not exposed to either his love or his fine sense of humor, often enough to compensate for the countless dreary hours during which she existed stoically under her mother's stern, somber, suffocating domination. For years, Ellen dreamed of the day she would leave home. She looked forward to that escape with every bit as much eagerness as a convict anticipating release from a real prison cell. But now that she was on her own, now that she had been out from under her mother's iron hand for more than a year, her future looked incredibly worse than it ever had looked before. Much worse. Something tapped on the window screen behind the booth. Ellen twisted around, looked up, startled for a moment. She couldn't see anything, just darkness. Tap, tap, tap. Who's there? Her voice as thin as tissue, her heart suddenly beating fast. Then lightning spread across the sky. A tracery of fiery veins and arteries. In the flickering pulse of light, there were large white moths fluttering against the screen. Jesus, she said softly. Only moths. She shuddered, turned away from the frantic insects, and sipped her bourbon. She couldn't live with this kind of tension. Not for long. She couldn't live in constant fear. She had to do something soon. Kill the baby. In the bassinet, the baby cried out again, a short, sharp noise, almost like a dog bark. A distant crack of thunder seemed to answer the child. The celestial rumbling briefly blotted out the unceasing voice of the wind, and it reverberated in the trailer's metal walls. The moths went tap, tap, tap. Ellen quickly drank her remaining bourbon and poured 2 more ounces into her glass. She found it difficult to believe that she had wound up in this shabby place in such anguish and misery. It seemed like a fever dream. Only 14 months ago, she had begun a new life with great expectations, with what had proved to be hopelessly naive optimism. Her world had collapsed into ruin so suddenly and so completely that she was still stunned. 6 weeks before her 19th birthday, she left home. She slipped away in the middle of the night, not bothering to announce her departure. Unable to face down her mother, she left a short, bitter note for Gina, and then she was off with the man she loved. Virtually any inexperienced small-town girl longing to escape boredom or oppressive parents would have fallen for a man like Conrad Straker. He was undeniably handsome. His straight, coal-black hair was thick and glossy. His features were rather aristocratic. High cheekbones, a patricianly strong nose, and strong chin. He had startling blue eyes, gas flame blue. He was tall, lean, and he moved with the grace of a dancer. But it wasn't even Conrad's looks that had most appealed to Ellen. She had been won by his style, his charm. He was a good talker, clever, with a gift for making the most extravagant flattery sound understated and sincere. Running away with a handsome carnival barker had seemed wildly romantic. They would travel all over the country, and she would see more of the world in 1 year than she expected to see in her entire life. There would be no boredom. Each day would be filled with excitement, color, music, lights, and the world of the carny, so different from that of her small town in Illinois farm country, was not governed by a long, complex, frustrating set of rules. She and Conrad were married in the best carnival tradition. The ceremony consisted of an after-hours ride on the merry-go-round with other carnies standing as witness. In the eyes of all true carnival people, their marriage was as binding and sacred as if it had been performed in a church by a minister with proper license in hand. After she became Miss Conrad Starker, Ellen was certain that only good times lay ahead. She was wrong. She had known Conrad for only 2 weeks before she had run off with him. Too late, she discovered she had just seen the best side of him. Since the wedding, she had learned that he was moody, difficult to live with, and capable of violence. At times, he was sweet, every bit as charming as when he had first been courting her. But he could turn vicious with an unexpected, inexplicable suddenness of a wild animal. During the past year, his dark moods had seized him with increasing frequency. He was sarcastic, petty, nasty, grim, and quick to strike Ellen when she displeased him. He enjoyed slapping, shoving, and pinching her. Early in the marriage, before she was pregnant, he had hit her in the stomach with his fist on 2 occasions while she had been carrying their child. Conrad had restricted his attacks, contenting himself to less brutal, but nonetheless frightening abuse. By the time she was 2 months pregnant, Ellen was almost desperate enough to go home to her parents. Almost. But when she thought of the humiliation she would have to endure, when she pictured herself begging Gina for another chance, when she thought of the smug self-righteousness with which her mother would greet her, she wasn't able to leave Stryker. She had nowhere else to go. As she grew heavy with child, she convinced herself that a baby would settle Conrad. He genuinely liked children. That was obvious because of the way he treated the offspring of other carnies. He appeared to be enchanted by the prospect of fatherhood. Ellen told herself that the presence of the baby would soften Conrad, mellow him, sweeten his temper. Then 6 weeks ago, that fragile hope was shattered when the baby arrived. Ellen hadn't gone to the hospital. That wasn't the true carny way. She had the baby at home in the trailer with a carnival midwife in attendance. The delivery had been relatively easy. She was never in any physical danger. There were no complications except the baby. She shivered with revulsion when she thought of the baby, and she had picked up her bourbon once more. As if it sensed that she was thinking about it, the child squalled again. "Shut up!" she screamed, putting her hands over her ears. "Shut up! Shut up!" It would not be quiet. The bassinet shook, rocked, creaked as the infant kicked and writhed in anger. Ellen tossed down the last of the bourbon in her glass, licked her lips nervously, and finally felt the whiskey power surging into her again. She slid out of the booth. She stood in the tiny kitchen swaying. The dissonant music of the oncoming storm crashed louder than ever, directly over the fairgrounds now, building rapidly to a furious crescendo. She weaved through the trailer and stopped at the foot of the bassinet. She switched on a lamp that produced a soft amber glow, and the shadow crawled away into huddle in the corner. The child stopped, struggling with its covers. It looked up at her, its eyes shining with hatred. She felt sick. "Kill it," she told herself. But the baby's malevolent glare was hypnotic. Ellen could not tear her eyes from its Medusian gaze. She couldn't move. She felt as if she'd been turned to stone. Lightning pressed its bright face to the window again, and the first fat drops of rain came with the subsequent growl of thunder. She stared at her child in horror, and beads of cold sweat popped along her hairline. The baby wasn't normal. It wasn't even close to normal. But there was no medical term for its deformity. In fact, you couldn't rightly call it a child. It was not a baby. It was a thing. It didn't seem deformed so much as it seemed to belong to a species entirely different from mankind. It was hideous. "Oh, God," Ellen said, her voice quivering. "God, why me? What have I done to deserve this?" The large green inhuman eyes of her offspring regarded her venomously. Ellen wanted to turn away from it. She wanted to run out of the trailer, into the crackling storm, into the vast darkness, out of the nightmare and into a new dawn. The creature's twisted, flared nostrils quivered like those of a wolf or a dog, and she could hear it sniffling eagerly as it sorted out her scent from the other odors in the trailer. "Kill it!" The Bible said, "Thou shalt not kill." Murder was a sin. If she strangled the baby, she would rot in hell. A series of cruel images flickered through her mind as visions of hell that her mother had painted for her during thousands of lectures about the terrible consequences of sin. Grinning demons tearing ragged goblets of flesh from living, screaming women, their leathery black lips slick with human blood, white-hot fire searing the bodies of sinners, pale worms feeding off still conscious dead men, agonizing people writhing painfully in mounds of indiscernibly horrible filth. Ellen was not a practicing Catholic, but that did not mean she was no longer a Catholic in her heart. Years of daily mass and nightly prayer, 19 indeterminable years of Gina's mad sermons and stern admonitions could not be sloshed off and forgotten so easily. Ellen still believed wholeheartedly in God, heaven, and hell. The Bible's warnings continued to hold value and meaning for her. Thou shalt not kill. But surely, she argued with herself, that commandment did not apply to animals. You were permitted to kill animals. That was not a mortal sin. And this thing in the bassinet was just an animal, a beast, a monster. It was not a human being. Therefore, if she destroyed it, that act of destruction would not seal the fate of her immortal soul. On the other hand, how could she be certain that it wasn't human? It had to have been born of man and woman. There couldn't be any more fundamental citation for humanity than that one. The child was a mutant, but it was a human mutant. Her dilemma seemed insoluble. In the bassinet, the small, swarthy creature raised one hand, reaching toward Ellen. It wasn't a hand, not really. It was a claw. The long, bony fingers were much too large to be those of a 6-week-old infant. Even though this baby was big for its age, like an animal's paws, the hands of this little beast were out of proportion to the rest. A sparse black fur covered the backs of its hands and bristled more densely around its knuckles. Amber light glinted off the sharp edges of the pointed fingernails. The child raked the air, but it was unable to reach Ellen. She couldn't understand how such a thing could have come from her. How could it possibly exist? She knew there were such things as freaks. Some of them worked in the sideshow in this very carnival. Bizarre-looking people, but not like this. None of them was half as weird as this thing that she had nurtured in her womb. Why had this happened? Why? Killing the child would be an act of mercy, after all. It would never be able to enjoy a normal life. It would always be a freak, an object of shame, ridicule, and desertion. Its days would be irrevocably stark, bitter, and lonely. Even the tamest and most ordinary pleasures would be denied it, and it would have no chance of attaining happiness. Furthermore, if she were forced to spend her life tending to this creature, she wouldn't find any happiness of her own. The prospect of raising this grotesque child filled her with such despair. Murdering it would be an act of mercy, benefiting both herself and the pitiful yet frightening mutant now glaring at her from the bassinet. But the Roman Catholic Church did not condone mercy killing. Even the highest motives would not save her from hell. She knew that her motives were not pure. Ridding herself of this burden was in part a selfish act. The creature continued to stare at her, and she had the unsettling feeling that its strange eyes were not merely looking at her, but through her, into her mind, her soul, past all pretension. It knew what she was contemplating, and he hated her for it. Its paled, speckled tongue slowly licked its dark, dark lips. It hissed defiantly at her. Whether or not this thing was human, whether or not killing it would be a sin, she knew that it was evil. It was not simply a deformed baby. It was something else. Something worse. It was dangerous, both less and more than human. Evil. She felt the truth of that in her heart and bones. Or am I crazy? She wondered. No, she couldn't allow doubt to creep in. She was not out of her mind, grief-stricken, deeply depressed, frightened, horrified, confused. She was all of these things, but she was not crazy. She perceived that the child was evil, and in that regard her perception was not askew. "Kill it!" The infant screamed. Its gravelly, strident voice grated on Ellen's nerves. She winced. Wind-driven sheets of rain drummed noisily against the trailer. Thunder picked up the night and vigorously rattled it again. The child squirmed, thrashed, and managed to push aside the thin blanket that had been draped across it. Hooking its bony hands on the edges of the bassinet, gripping with its wicked claws, it strained forward and sat up. Ellen gasped. It was too young to sit up on its own with such assurance. It hissed at her. The thing was growing at a frightening rate. It was always hungry, and she fed it more than twice as much as she would have fed an ordinary child. Week by week, she could see the amazing changes in it. With surprising, disquieted swiftness, it was learning how to use its body. Before long, it would be able to crawl, then walk. And then what? How big, how mobile would it have to get before she would no longer have any control over it? Her mouth was dry and sour. She tried to work up some saliva, but there was none. A trickle of cold sweat broke from her hairline and wriggled down her forehead into the corner of one eye. She blinked away the salty fluid. If she could place the child in an institution where it belonged, she would not have to murder it. But Conrad would never agree to giving up his baby. He was not the least bit revolted by it. He was not frightened of it either. He actually seemed to cherish it more than he might have done a healthy child. He took considerable pride in having fathered the creature, and to Ellen his pride was a sign of madness. Even if she could commit the thing to an institution, that solution would not be final. The evil would still exist, and she knew the child was evil, knew it beyond the slightest doubt, and she felt responsible for bringing such a creature into the world. She could not simply turn her back and walk away and let someone else deal with it. What if, grown larger, it killed someone? Wouldn't the responsibility for that death rest on her shoulders? The air coming through the open windows was much cooler than it had been before the rain had begun to fall. A chilly draft brushed the back of Ellen's neck. The child began trying to get out of the bassinet. Finally, summoning all of her bourbon-inspired courage, her teeth chattering, her hands trembling as if they were afflicted by palsy, she took hold of the baby. No, the thing. She must not think of it as a baby. She could not allow herself the luxury of sentiment. She must act. She must be cold, unmoved, impeccable iron will. She attended to lift the loathsome creature, retrieve the satin-encased pillow that was under its head, and then smother it with the same pillow. She didn't want to leave any obvious marks of violence on the body. The death must appear to be natural. Even healthy babies sometimes died in their cribs without apparent cause. No one would be surprised or suspicious if this pitiful deformity passed away quietly in its sleep. But as she lifted the thing off the pillow, it responded with such shocking fury that her plan instantly became unworkable. The creature squealed. It clawed her. She cried out in pain as its sharp nails gouged and sliced her forearms. Blood. Slender ribbons of blood. The infant squirmed and kicked, and Ellen had difficulty holding on to it. The thing pursed its twisted mouth and spat at her. A vicious, foul-smelling glob of yellowish spittle struck her nose. She shuddered and gagged. The child thing peeled its dark lips back from its molted gums and hissed at her. Thunder smashed the porcelain night, and the lights in the trailer blinked once, blinked twice, and lightning coruscated through the brief spell of the blackness before the lamps came on again. Please, God, she thought desperately, don't leave me in the dark with this thing. Its bulging green eyes seemed to radiate a peculiar light, a phosphorescent glow that appeared impossibly to come from within them. The thing screeched and writhed, and it urinated. Ellen's heart jackhammered. The thing tore at her hands, scratching, drawing blood. It gouged the soft flesh of her palms as it ripped off one of her thumbnails. She heard an eerie, high-pitched ululation, quite unlike anything she'd ever heard before, and she didn't realize it for several seconds that she was listening to her own shrill screaming. If she could have thrown the creature down, if she could have turned away from it and run, she would have done just that. But suddenly she found that she was unable to release it. The thing had a fierce grip on her arms, and it wouldn't let go. She struggled with the inhumanly ferocious child, and the bassinet almost tipped over. Her shadow swayed wildly across the nearby bed and up the wall, bobbing against the rounded ceiling, cursing, straining. Trying to keep the creature at the arm's length, she managed to shift her left hand to its throat, and then her right hand, and she squeezed hard, bearing down, gritting her teeth, repelled by the savagery she felt rising within herself, frightened by her own newly discovered capacity for violence, but determined to choke the life out of the thing. It wasn't going to die easily. Ellen was surprised by the rigid, resistant muscle in its neck. It crabbed its claws higher on her arms and dug its nails into her again, making 10 fresh puncture wounds in her skin. The pain prevented Ellen from putting all of her strength into the frantic attempt to strangle the thing. It rolled its eyes and refocused on her with even more evident hatred than before. A silvery stream of thick drool oozed out of one corner of its mouth and down its pebbled chin. The twisted mouth opened wide, the dark, leathery lips writhed. A snaky, pale, pointed tongue curled and uncurled obscenely. The child pulled Ellen toward it with improbable strength. She could not keep it safely at arm's length as she wanted. It drew her relentlessly down towards the bassinet, and at the same time it pulled itself up. Die, damn you, die! She was bent over the bassinet now, leaning into it. Her grip on the child's throat was weakened by her new position. Her face was only 8 or 10 inches from the creature's repugnant countenance. Its rank breath washed over it. It spat in her face again. Something brushed her belly. She gasped, jerked, fabric ripped, her blouse. The child was kicking out with its long-toed, clawed feet, and it was trying to gouge her breasts and stomach. She attempted to draw back, but the thing held her close, held her with demonic power of perseverance. Ellen felt dizzy, fuzzy, whiskey sick, terror sick. Then her vision blurred. Her ears were filled with the roaring suction of her own breath, but she couldn't seem to breathe fast enough. She was lightheaded. Sweat flew off her brow and spattered the child as she wrestled with it. The thing grinned as if it sensed triumph. I'm losing, she thought desperately. How can that be? My God, it's going to kill me. Thunder pounded the sky and lightning burst from the broken night. A mallet of wind struck the trailer broadside. The lights went out and stayed out. The child fought with renewed fury. It was not weak like the human infant. It had weighed almost 11 pounds at birth, and it had gained phenomenally more than 12 pounds in the past 6 weeks. Almost 23 pounds now, and no fat, just muscle. A hard, sinuously grisly infant, like a young gorilla. It was as strong and as energetic as a 6-month-old chimpanzee that performed in one of the carnival's more popular sideshows. The bassinet toppled with a crash, and Ellen stumbled over it. She fell. With the child, it was close again to her now. No longer safely at arm's reach, it was on top of her, gurgling, snarling. Its taloned feet found purchase on her hips, and it tried to tear through the heavy denim jeans she was wearing. No! She shouted. A thought snapped through her mind. I've got to wake up. But she knew she was already awake. The thing continued to hold her right arm, its nails hooked in her flesh. But it let go of her left arm. In the blackness, she sensed the hooked claw reaching for her throat, her vulnerable jugular vein. She turned her head aside. The small yet incredibly long-fingered and deadly hand brushed past her throat, barely missing her. She rolled, and then the child thing was on the bottom. Whimpering, teetering on the wire of hysteria, she tore her right arm loose of the creature's steely grip at the expense of a new pain, and she felt for its arms in the darkness, found its wrists, held its hands away from her face. The thing kicked at her stomach again, but she avoided its sharp, powerful legs. She managed to put one of her knees on its chest, pinning it. She bore down with all of her weight. The creature's ribs and breastbone gave way beneath her. She heard something crack inside the thing. It wailed like a banshee. Ellen knew, at last, that she had a chance to survive. There was a sickening crunch, a wet sound, a horrible mashing, squashing, and all the fight went out of her. Alexa, off. Sorry about that, guys.